Hi, I'm Barbara Fox, and today I wanted to do a video on optical connectors in an IP world. So why do we care about optical connectors in our routers and switches? I mean, basically, why did Cisco pay $4.5 billion for Acacia? So I wanted to understand this because when I wrote frame realize software, I never worried about the TDM network. And when I wrote ATM software, I never worried about the SONET network. And when I wrote IP software, I never worried about the Ethernet. So I didn't understand, why do I care about this? So that was my whole investigation. Just fair warning, I don't know why Cisco paid $4.5 billion for Acacia. Uh, okay, so if we look at the network bandwidth requirements are really growing. So the towers, instead of having 1 gig uplinks or 10 gig uplinks, they're going to have 25 gig or 100 gig uplinks. There are going to be more towers for 5G. There's a lot of homes that are moving the amount of bandwidth that they're buying from their service provider. They're moving that value up. A lot of people are working from home, so there's a lot more traffic on the network, and you can just feel it when you're working from home or when you're at home. You can experience a lot more delays in your connectivity. And so even the bandwidth, now we're starting to have 10 gig, 25 gig, 100 gig NIDs uh, in the access part of the network. So really there's just a lot more bandwidth, and there's a lot of content providers who are moving content around in the network. So if you look at the network, fiber's connecting everything. So in the access and aggregation part of the network, the fibers are tens of kilometers long. In the metro, they're hundreds of kilometers long. In long haul, they're thousands of kilometers long. And in submarine, they're tens of thousands of kilometers long. So fiber is connecting a lot of different routers, switches, network equipment together. And these fibers are quite long. And so what's being connected? So we have a content providers who are connecting content. They're pushing content around the network because they're trying to get the content closer to the users so that the users have a good experience when they download content from the network. So content providers are pushing a lot of content to be closer to the network, closer to the users, and the users are upping their bandwidth so that they can download all this content. So there's a lot of data being pushed around the network. So if we're using fiber to carry all of this traffic, what does the fiber look like? So I'm starting with gray optic fiber. Gray optic fiber is when you really only have one wavelength running on the fiber, and that's like what we would have in a lab or something. So we have single mode or multi-mode fiber, and it's running one wavelength at 1310 or 850. That's the lane that the wavelength is running in. For CWDM, coarse wave division multiplexing channels, that you might have 10 channels, and each of them have a location for each wavelength in the spectrum. For FiOS, we have FiOS, and FiOS has 3 wavelengths on it, right? FiOS to your house has 3 wavelengths. One that's upstream from your house to the network, and that can carry 1.2 gigabit of traffic. We've got a downstream wavelength that can carry 2.4, so from the network to your house. And then a third wavelength that carries all the TV channels. And so the old FiOS commercials used to say, oh, we have 1310, 1490, 1550. That's basically where the wavelengths are running on the fiber. Now, for DWDM, or dense wave division multiplexing, basically what the optical equipment pushes around, they can carry 88 or 96 wavelengths on a single fiber pair. So, I mean, they're carrying a lot of data on a fiber. And so so as I said, there's 88 to 96 wavelengths on the C-band. And that's traditionally what the optical equipment used, the C-band in the optical spectrum. Now what they're doing is they're also including the L-band so that they can basically double the number of wavelengths that are supported. So you can get even more wavelengths on your fiber. So in your network, really the most expensive part of your network is the fiber. So they have to buy rights of way to bury fiber along the street or along railroad tracks or wherever they're burying it. And they also have all the labor costs of actually burying the fiber. And then it's not that easy to fix when something happens to it, if a backhoe, splits it or whatever. So really the most expensive part of your network is your fiber plant and your DWDM equipment. The the least expensive part of your network is like your access aggregation equipment. But it's also the most expensive parts of your network have the longest life cycle. They exist for much longer. And the least expensive parts of your network have the shortest life cycle. They're switched in and out much more often. So if you look at the network, when we're running waves or we run OTN over waves so that we can split a wave up into different channels, those are synchronous, that's synchronous traffic. So whatever goes into the wave is what comes out of it. There's no aggregation in the wave. The only way to aggregate traffic is to terminate a wave on a piece of networking equipment, add more data, and then reinitiate the wave. You can't, once data goes into the wave, you can't add any more data into that wave. With Ethernet, we have statistical multiplexing, and it's an asynchronous protocol. So you only send data when there is data to be sent. And so in that way, we make better use of our big pipes because we can aggregate more pipes into those big pipes. So if you had a hub and spoke service and it was an OTN service, if you had 10 spokes and one hub, and each of the spokes had a 1 gig uplink, the hub would have to have a 10 gig uplink to service those 10 spokes. With Ethernet, you could have a 10 gig uplink at the hub, and you could have 15, 20 spokes, each with a 1 gig uplink, because we're assuming that not all of the sites are going to send 1 gig of traffic at the same time. So we're looking at the law of averages, that we can aggregate the traffic. We can aggregate more traffic onto a single pipe. And so you get economies of scale that way. So we oversubscribe with Ethernet. With wavelengths and OTN, we don't oversubscribe. So what do we do on these fibers? So the way that fiber used to work, the wavelengths on the fiber used to work, is that it worked on, off, on, off, on, off. So if you had 100 gigabits of data, there would be 100 gigabits of time slot in that, in the data that was transmitted. And at every time slot, it would be either on or off. So the wavelength would either be high because the light was on, or it would be off. And so this worked till we got to about 10 gigabits of data. And when the optical guys got to 10 gigabits of data, they said, whoa, when we want to get to 100 gigabits or more of data, it's going to be very hard to turn the light on and off, 100 gigabit times in a second to put that much data through on one wavelength. So they're very smart, and I don't really understand how any of this works, but I'll just tell you how I think of it. They used phase and polarization along with these wavelengths. And so the way I think of it is, instead of just sending one on-off down the wavelength, what they do is they send one on-off like in a vertical position, and then maybe another one in a horizontal position, and then another one at different angles. So they're sending all of the information at different angles, and instead of just having a 1 or a 0 when it's received, it has like a little pattern of the information that's being sent at these different angles, and they call that a symbol. So there's a symbol rate of the data that they're receiving. So instead of that indicating just a 1 or a 0, it can indicate a number of bits worth of data in each time period. So in this way, they can grow the amount of traffic that they send down the wavelength. So I don't really know how it works, but that's how I think of it. Now, the other thing about wavelengths is that they're light, so they fade over distance. So some of your transceivers are more powerful than your other transceivers, so they can actually send the light further. So that's something to take into consideration. And then the other thing that you always have to think about is that fiber can be of better or worse quality, the fiber itself. So just like a road, you can send more traffic over a good road than you can send over a bad road. It's the same with fiber. And what these coherent optics do is they do a lot of forward error correction. And the transmitter and the receiver talk to each other, and they determine the quality of the fiber for their conversation. And then they determine how they're going to do error correction. And so in this way, they're able to make better use of not as good as lesser quality fiber. So the better the forward error correction, the more use you can get out of worse fiber. So that's also a very important thing in coherent optics. So a coherent modem is a transceiver, and the modem consists of two parts. There's the DSP and the electro-optics. So the DSP is a digital signal processor. It's the ASIC, and it's basically the brains. It understands how to send all of this traffic down to create these symbols. And it also, the DSP on the transmitter talks to the DSP on the receiver, and they determine how this forward error correction is going to happen. These DSPs are also programmable, and we'll talk about them, and they also mitigate dispersion. So even if you were driving down the road and you were going really fast, you might have a tendency to veer off the road. It's the same with light, so they have to make sure that the light doesn't leave the fiber so that it's all transmitted. Then you have the electro-optics part of the modem, and that's the part that actually sends and receives the light. So it does what the DSP tells it to do, to forward the traffic by converting the electrons into photons. So there are two types of coherent modems. There are ACO modems and DCO modems. So with ACO modems, the DSP is on the board. It's not in the transceiver itself. And so in that case, the transceivers can be smaller. And like especially in the data center, you can have one DSP that can manage multiple plugs. In a DCO, the DSP is actually in the transceiver. And so all of the brains is in the physical transceiver that you plug into your system. So originally, there were no standards for the software interface to the DSP. There was no interoperability between DSPs, and so there was no interoperability between transceivers from different vendors. So basically, everything was proprietary. Like one vendor's equipment only talked to its own equipment. So you would have to bookend by vendor. So people don't really like that. So what they wanted to do was standardize transceivers. And like all standards, what they do is they have mandatory parts of it, and then vendors are able to make transceivers that are better than the mandatory part that is part of the transceiver, and that's what their special sauce is. But the first thing that they do is they need to standardize the transceivers. And so the first transceiver that we're going to talk about is the 400G ZR, and it's defined by the OIF. It's really for data center interconnect, and it can go 120 kilometers. It's got an edge optimized spec, and it uses low power. Now, this wavelength is standard. This standard is here in the table. So it's standardized by the OIF. It's being deployed now, and it runs IP over Dwdm. So it's IP wavelengths straight on the fiber, on the wavelengths. There's also something that's called 400ZR Plus. This isn't a standard, it's an agreement. So it's not as rigorous. The definition of it isn't as rigorous because it's really only an agreement between different vendors. It doesn't have to have all of the standardization that a real standard has. but it has better FEC and it supports more higher bandwidth, and it goes a little bit further. It takes more power. There's also another standard, which is an OTN. So instead of just being, this is also, this is also IP over a wavelength. There's also another standard put out by the ITU, Open ROADM and Cable Labs, which is really, it's another 400 gig standard that has OTN running over the wavelength. So it would be IP running over OTN over the wavelength. And this also uses a very good FEC. And it can go much further. It's designed to go further. So if we look at this table, okay, first of all, there are two form factors here. There's the QSFP-DD, and that the 400ZR can use a QSFP-DD transceiver. And these other modes can be either in a QSFP-DD or a CFP-DCO transceiver. So there's two form factors that can plug into your router. So here these are the different modes that we're talking about. Now this is the rate of the symbols that are being sent down the wavelength. This is how much bandwidth, that the line rate that they support, the distance that it travels, the FEC. So this is going to control how much fiber you can use. So you might not be able, if you have really crappy fiber, you might not be able to go as far, but you might be able to use fiber that you thought was unusable if you have a very good FEC. And then I want you to also look at this gigahertz spacing. We're going to talk about this in a minute. There's 50 and 75 gigahertz here. So these are the different coherent transmission modes that can be used with these transceivers. Now, vendors also have their own proprietary modes that may be able to go further, have better FEC for these same form factors. But in that case, if you were using a proprietary solution, you could program the transceiver to run in the vendor's proprietary way. You might get more, it might work better, but you'd have to bookend the transceivers so that both of them were the same vendors, because that's really the DSPs it's really that the DSPs are working in a different way and they need to talk to each other. So they have to be the same DSP running in the same mode at both ends of the fiber. So really each of these can be programmed to run in whatever mode we're talking about here. So I said that I wanted you to look at that gigahertz. Now, if we look at the C-band, it's actually 4.4 terahertz wide. So I think of it as a road. So there's a certain amount of spectrum in the road. And back in the day, what all of the optical equipment did is they broke this 4.4 terahertz into 50 gigahertz channels, which gave you 88 channels, right? So basically 88 wavelengths are running over the fiber in the C-band, okay? And what happened is they used 37.5 gigahertz of that channel for the wavelength itself, and then they had guard bands that are 6.25 gigahertz. So between every wavelength, you'd have 6.25 gigahertz of guard band, and then you'd have 37.5 gig for whatever wavelength traffic you're sending down the fiber. Now this worked great, and this is the way things ran for a really long time. But now you see in this previous slide that we're starting to use 75 gigahertz when we're supporting 400 gig. So if your optical infrastructure, your optical underlay only supports 50 gigahertz, then you're not going to be able to support a 400 gigahertz transceiver, right? A 400 gig transceiver, gigabit, not gigahertz, a 400 gig transceiver. So what was created is FlexGrid, and what that lets you do is actually widen these lanes to support however wide the lane needs to be to support the higher amounts of traffic. So you might have one lane that's 75 gigahertz with the 6.25 guard bands, and then another one that's the 50 gigahertz. And this is programmable in your optical underlay. So you need to understand what the optical underlay is able to do when you're going to forward the traffic over the optical underlay. And that will also affect what transceivers that you can put into your equipment. Now, the other thing that's kind of cool that I'll just talk about anyway is, so this is in the C band. Now we have this again in the L band. The other thing that they used to do is basically if there was no wavelength in a lane, nothing would be sent down the lane. And so what happened is when you wanted to add a wavelength into a fiber, there's some sort of like power balancing or something, I'm not exactly sure, that has to go on. So when you decide to add a new wavelength, you sort of have to condition all the existing wavelengths to get ready for this new wavelength to come in. So it takes a while because you've got to balance power, I don't know. So it takes a little while to do it. What new optical systems have started doing is instead of just sending nothing when there's no wavelength, what they do is they send noise. And then what that enables you to do is just stop sending the noise and put the wavelength data down that lane. And then it doesn't affect any of the other wavelengths. And so you can do it immediately. There's no problem. And what that enables is if you're going to be able to instantly add a new wavelength into the fiber, it lets you actually now start to signal your wavelengths. So you can actually use control plane to move a wavelength from one fiber to another fiber in the case of a fiber cut or something. So it gives you a lot better use of your optical network. So it's just something cool. Now, the other thing that if you're using those OTN transceivers, we support Flex Ethernet, and that's also defined by the OIF. And what flexible Ethernet does is it lets you combine certain ports together, physical ports together. So, you know, when new, like really high speed ports come out, they're really, really, really expensive. I remember when 10 gig ports came out and they were really expensive. They were like $150,000 for a 10 gig port, which seems ridiculous now. But so now if you think about it, 400 gig, 800 gig ports, those are going to be expensive ports on the router. And maybe you're not going to need that much traffic. And maybe the 100 gig ports are much cheaper. And say you're going to send 300 gig of traffic instead of 400 gig. Instead of buying a 400 gig port on the router, what you can do is you can use Flex Ethernet to combine the three 100 gig ports to create a single interface between a pair of routers. So you're saying, well, I can already do that with lag. What do I need Flex Ethernet for? Well, the way lag works is, you know, all the traffic that goes on an IP network has to be in order, right? So if you're running lag on 3 physical ports, what you do is you hash the source destination, the ports, and the protocol to a certain physical port. And all of the data in that flow will always flow over that physical port. So if you have a really fat flow and I don't know, your traffic is a certain way, it could end up that of your 3 physical ports, you're really banging one of them and maybe the other 2 are not really being used as lightly just because of the mix of the traffic that you're using. So you're not exactly getting the 300 gig out of your physical ports. With FlexE, you don't have to worry about hashing flows to particular physical ports because it's all time-based. So basically, you can send 100 gig down the first port, 100 gig down the second port, 100 gig down the third port, then first port, second port, third port. So it lets you get the full 300 gig out of your 3 physical 100 gig ports. So that's, you know, that's a really great benefit. The other thing that it lets you do is subrate ports. So say you had 100 gig port, you're a service provider and you have access to towers at the in your area. And what you're doing is you're going to sell 25 gig connectivity to 3 mobile operators, right? So you might have just use one 100 gig interface out to your router that's going to that tower. And you can physically subrate that down to the 325 gig ports. So instead of, in this way, one vendor's traffic, one of your mobile operators' traffic can't affect any of your other mobile operators' traffic in any way, because they are physically separated, even though they're running down the same physical interface. So you don't have to worry about CIR or any of that within the, between the different Flex Ethernet subrated ports. The other thing that this lets you do is it lets you run hard splicing in a 5G network instead of just soft slicing. So this is another good benefit of Flex Ethernet. So there's not just coherent transceivers, there are also non-coherent transceivers. So one of them, one type are the PON, the passive optical network transceivers, and that's what I was talking about with FiOS. So there's EPON, which lets you run 1 gig upstream and downstream symmetrical. There's GPON, that is basically what I was describing before, 2.5 gig downstream and 1.25 gig upstream. There's also 10G PON, it's also known as XG PON, where you're running 10 gigabits over existing dark fiber. And there's also XGS PON, which lets you run, it's defined by the ITU-T, and it lets you run 10 gig symmetrical traffic. So this is helping, by upping these rates for PON, it's helping bring more traffic to the homes, right? There's a lot more traffic that can flow over these transceivers, and also because they're symmetrical, you can use this for business customers as well. There's also another type of transceiver called PAM4, and so I was saying that for a single, in a time period, you would do a 0 or a 1 to indicate either a 1 or a 0, on or off to indicate a 1 or a 0. For PAM4, what they do is, instead of just having the wavelength be either 0 or 1, they let the wavelength in the same time period be either 0, a quarter, a half, 3/4, or 1. So basically, instead of just being 0, 1, having two values, it's 0, quarter, half, 3/4, or 1. So it has 4 values. So in the same time period, you're doubling the rate of traffic that you can send through. And so PAM4 is used, you can send up to 400 gig of traffic on some PAM4, using PAM4 if you've got good fiber. So that's a definite benefit. One of the problems with it is that the signal to noise ratio is much higher. And so you really have to have good fiber for this to work. And it's a little bit more expensive, but it's still a good solution. So for transceivers that only support one wavelength, we've, that are not coherent transceivers, we've got SFPs, SFP plus, SFP 28s, and they support different amounts of traffic. We have QSFPs, and this is the same form factor for all of these. And these are non-coherent versions, but there's also a coherent version of the QSFP DD. And so it fits in the same slot because it's the same form factor. Okay, so we have, and so they each send traffic in different ways. Okay, so they're using basically the electro-optics part of the coherent, of the modem to forward traffic in different ways. So these guys have to be bookended, right? Because you need to make sure that you're getting the traffic through. But these are pretty widely, they're not proprietary in any way. They're all standardized, so you can buy the same transceiver from different vendors and use them together. So for coherent transceivers, we have the QSFP DD, which is the same form factor as the other one. We also have a CFP DCO, which is CFP2 DSCO, which is a little bit bigger. There's also an OSFP. This isn't that popular right now. It's slightly bigger than the QSF PDD, but it may become popular in the future. So I know there's a guy at Arista who really likes them. So it's just something to think about. It's gonna, you'd have to have a slot that it fit into on the routers. But right now it's not really that popular. So when you're going to select a transceiver, what do you want to think about? So you want to think about how much bandwidth do I need to push? What's the distance that I need to push it? How much power and what's the size of the transceiver that I'm going to use? What does the reliability have to be? Basically, what's the state of my fiber? Is it really pristine fiber? Is it kind of old fiber? Am I trying to repurpose written off fiber? How good does the transceiver have to be? How good does the FEC have to be able to push traffic on the fiber that I'm using? You want it to be easy to use. You're going to program. You need to be able to program the transceiver for the mode. So basically, how are you going to use it? Which of those modes that we looked at on that other sheet are you going to use? We're going to program the color, basically the wavelength, and we'll talk about that in a minute too. But basically, we had that C-band, and I showed you that there were 10 channels for the CWDM, and there are 88 channels for the C-band. And so basically what you're going to do is program, what color you're going to use. And that's so you want to be able to program the transceiver to color to what channel your wavelength is going to travel in. You want to have transceivers that are easy to manage, that you can configure, and then you can pull information and analytics from. You have to decide if it has to be hardened. Does it need to run outside? Is it going to be inside? Is it going to be in a cabinet outside? So how hardened does the transceiver have to be? And then you need to consider the underlying optical infrastructure. If it's going to run over the optical infrastructure, does it need flex grid? Can it run on an older optical system, optical infrastructure? And basically, what's the cost? So I just thought I'd show one other thing. So now we have these routers, right? And what we're doing is we're going to put these transceivers in. Now, the transceivers are, and what they're doing is they're actually, the reason that you use a coherent transceiver is that the traffic is going to be put on a wavelength that's not a gray optics wavelength. That's actually a C-band wavelength or an L-band wavelength, a C-band wavelength really right now. So it's going to be a wavelength that's going in that C-band, and so it can be aggregated with all the other C-band traffic and sent down a system. So you're thinking, well, why do I care about that? Why do I need to do that? Well, if you have the traffic coming out of your router as a gray optic, as not a C-band optic, then it has to go into a transponder. And what a transponder does is it takes a gray optic and it converts the wavelength into a C-band wavelength. So if it came in 850 and you want it to come out on a C-band channel, you have to actually use a transponder to do that, and that might be a piece of equipment, and so that's adding cost to your network. So if you put a transceiver directly into your router, then it comes out and it can go on to the optical infrastructure just immediately. It doesn't have to go through a transponder, and so that's going to take some of the cost out of your network. And so that's really the main reason why you want to put these transceivers. I mean, besides distance, actually, there's a lot of reasons, but that's one reason, to really save money, so it doesn't have to go through a transponder. You put one of these coherent transceivers into the router. Now, when it comes out, this is just an example of a system. When they go into the system, you can either create point-to-point connections. So you might just want to connect two routers together, Or maybe you're in a metro region and you want to be able to, you have a ring and you want to bring everything back to your CO or your internet exchange. And so you have basically two hubs and everything else is a spoke in the ring. And all of the traffic is being aggregated to a router, and that router is actually going to plug into one of these optical devices, and everything is going to be pulled back to these two, to the two hub devices, and then they'll go into the routers that are sitting at the hubs. So all of your traffic, so it's a good way to aggregate all of your traffic and then put it on a single fiber. Because the fiber is the most expensive part of your network, you want to make the best use of it. So you're pulling a lot of traffic back and pushing it on the fiber. Now, the fiber all has it's all these different wavelengths, and you don't want to use the same wavelength. You can't use the same wavelength at different places on the same fiber. So what has to happen is if you plug your router uplink into one of these ports, you have to determine which wavelength you're going to plug into. So you're going to configure your transceiver with the right wavelength, and then you plug it into your optical piece of equipment. So say there were 88 wavelengths on this ring, and you had, say you had 11 devices on the ring. You could have 8 wavelengths on each device, and you would plug, but this piece of optical equipment would have to use 8 of the wavelengths. This one would have another 8. This one would have another 8. So all the 11 would each have 8 different wavelengths that they used, and all of that information would be pulled back to the hubs. And so you would have to, and then you would configure the routers, the transceivers within the routers that we're going to plug into this optical equipment to bring the information back. I hope that's clear. That was a little bit fuzzy, but this is basically showing you it's got different colors, but you would configure your router uplink to be 191.7, and then you would plug your uplink into this port, and then you would own this wavelength, and that wavelength would be carried back to the two routers at the hub. So I hope this helped you understand why transceivers are important and why you have to know something about them. It still didn't answer for me why Acacia was worth $4.5 billion to Cisco, but I'm hoping to still figure that out. So thanks for your attention, and let me know if you have any questions. All right, take care. Thanks.